Thanks for joining us at The Forgotten, Literature, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands After the Hurricanes. My name is Frances Robles. They call me Frenchie. And I'm a correspondent with the New York Times. I spent most of this summer and fall, I guess, and part of the winter, in Puerto Rico covering the hurricanes. So I was really thrilled when Arlo asked me to step in and speak to our esteemed guests here. We're here with Tiphanie, Yanique, author of Land of Love and Drowning. She's an associate professor at Wesleyan. And Esmeralda Santiago. She is the author of 3 memoirs, 2 novels, a children's book, and she's edited 2 anthologies of Latino literature. She's the author I'm getting nervous. Her first memoir is When I Was Puerto Rican, which is a classic, especially for people like me who grew up straddled between Brooklyn and Puerto This So one thing that I wanted to know before we got started, I'm curious to know how many people here did not have electricity this September. How many people here are locals? Okay, some. Wow. Well, I'm a local, and I'm proud to say that this week I finally got the smell out of my refrigerator. so this is an important week for me as a Puerto Rican who lost power and then spent many weeks chronicling the stories of the people of Puerto Rico. And I'm actually very ashamed to say that I did not spend any time chronicling the stories of the people in the Virgin Islands, which is one of the things that we're going to talk about, is something that a lot of people forgot, is that the Virgin Islands was actually hit by 2 Category 5 hurricanes this year. I think Virgin Islands only has about 100,000 people, and it's fair to say that it became the forgotten storm. As Tiphanie pointed out in an op-ed this fall in the New York Times, she was rather offended when President Trump's Homeland Security advisor made references to evacuating the United States citizens from the Virgin Islands, as if all of the people in the Virgin Islands were not United States citizens. Tiphanie was rather offended, and her commentary foreshadowed what was to come when President Trump told everyone that he had spoken to the president of the Virgin Islands. We're still trying to figure out who that was that he spoke to. So, since I was remiss this year in not visiting the Virgin Islands, I wanted to start with Tiphanie to talk a little bit about that, about being the forgotten island. I wonder if it was it hurtful to you? And is there a way, and Esmeralda, think of this as well for you, is there a way for any of us to understand all of these hurricanes without thinking of it in that political status sense, and that, I guess I don't want to use the word colonial, but in that colonial sense? So, Tiphanie, why don't you start with that?
Thank you, and thank you to Arlo for having the wisdom and generosity to put together a panel like this. I would say, especially in a seminar about writers of the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, and especially the Virgin Islands, will often be left out of that conversation. Forgotten, not included, and maybe the reason for that is political. Not because we're small. Puerto Rico is actually one of the larger Caribbean islands, but because I think the conversations about post-colonial identity, about overcoming colonial regimes, becomes very uncomfortable when we talk about Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, because we are still colonies. And in fact, we are colonies of the United States. And so I think often American literary spaces will ignore us because we cause discomfort to Americans. The fact that we exist is discomforting. But even in the Caribbean, we are very often, I was going to say categorically ignored too, because we are the Americans. So we are often considered not Caribbean enough, not properly Caribbean because we carry American passports. And America now, unlike Europe of a past generation, is now the colonial force, even if not actual colonial imperialistic owners of the Caribbean, is has an imperialistic presence in the Caribbean. And so many Caribbean writers and thinkers have an antagonistic relationship with America. So then we inherit sometimes that antagonism because we are the Yankees in the region. So we get forgotten all the time. And so I would say that I wasn't so much hurt by being forgotten because I expected to be forgotten. Virgin Islanders are really accustomed to immigrating into our own nation. We come to the US and experience culture shock, realize that nothing that we are is recognizable by our fellow citizens in North America. But also because we speak English, and most of us, as I said on an earlier panel, can at least mimic standard English. We end up becoming invisible phenotypically as well. So if you're a white person from the Virgin Islands, you end up just looking like a white American, and maybe entering and communicating in the world as a white American. And if you're Afro-Caribbean, you might enter into the US and be subsumed by African American culture because you can speak in a standard American lingo. So you look like an African American, and I am subsumed by African American culture and often get put in that category, which politically I've come to accept because, when the police stop you, they're not going to ask you which kind of African you are. You look like an African American, you get treated like one. So for me, I expected it. I wasn't sad, but it told me that politics are in everything. So would you imagine that the reason that the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico were so forgotten is because of political realities? But that is why. I mean, that is why when the news were saying that the hurricanes have hit Florida, they finally hit the United States. The hurricanes have hit the United States when they hit the Florida Keys. And I was like, they actually, hit America 8 days ago when they hit the Virgin Islands. So I was angry, but I wasn't sad because I expected to be treated like, the outside, the unclaimed, the illegitimate child. That's how we're treated.
Okay.
Well, we live in the United States of America. America is a hemisphere, it's not a country. And so I get really upset when I hear people saying, oh, I'm American. Well, obviously, if you live in the United States or if you were born in the United States or in this hemisphere. But I like to use the word estadounidense, which it's kind of awkward if you say it in English, United Stater, because I think that's much more specific, and I think it really points the fact that we, in this continent, we are part of a hemisphere of people who come from all over other parts of the world, and we're all American. People in Argentina are American. I'm sorry if it's a problem for you, but we are. And in Puerto Rico, one of our issues, of course, is that our native tongue is Spanish. So we are estadounidense, or citizens of the United States of America. We are not American, we are citizens of, because Puerto Ricans feel, many of us, feel very much like it is a nación. It's not just an island, it is a nation to us. It is our home, it is a country, but we are a colony of the United States of America. So
did you find yourself like throwing things at the TV?
You heard the rage, didn't you? I can't keep it down too much because it really is. I would like to find a way to make sure that everyone in the United States understands that America is a hemisphere. It's not just this part of half the world. And I think if we began to imagine that then all of us can have a sense of nationhood, but also belong to the hemisphere, I think.
Both of you dedicate a pretty long passage in your books to a hurricane. I think yours is fictional, right? Hurricane Mary is fictional, and in your memoir, it's Hurricane Santa Clara. In Puerto Rico, they named the hurricanes, or they used to name the hurricane, for the day that of the saint of the calendar year. So it's actually Hurricane Betsy. I looked it up. It was 1956. But in Puerto Rico, they called it Santa Clara, and it was a big moment in your life because it's what led your mother to go back to work. I can't help but wonder, as I read your books, who's going to be writing these stories of Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma? Is it going to be the two of you? And I also wonder, in the moments that this was passing and in the weeks as all this tragedy was unfolding, could you write? Or was it too painful?
I couldn't. I couldn't for several weeks because I had a lot of relatives there who were, I couldn't reach them. I have the last of my previous generation, my aunt, after whom I'm named, and the only sibling of my 12 aunts and uncles from my dad, because my dad had passed away the year before. So I was really in a panic trying to find my 96-year-old aunt and my cousins who live in the same house with her, and my nieces and nephews who live in Bayamón and Levittown, which were very badly flooded. So for the first couple of weeks, until I was able to reach anyone, it was impossible for me to write, and I could, not even a grocery list. It was just difficult for me to focus on anything but what was going on there, and feeling completely helpless. And your first instinct is, I'm just gonna get a shovel and a pick, and I'm gonna go down there, with equipment, and then I realized I'm an old lady who can't do that stuff anymore. But you just want to do it, and finally realized, they have no electricity, they have no running water, they have no support from the government that's keeping us a colony. The one thing that I can do is to raise money from my wealthy friends. And so the thing that I've never done is to go to people that I know, who have the nice cars, and say, I'm raising funds for Puerto Rico relief. And that's how I focused my rage and sorrow, was in trying to raise money for some organizations that I knew were working with the people who have the shovels and all,
Can you tell us a little bit about that organization? I know that people are always asking me, how can I help? Where do I donate? And I actually don't know what to tell them.
I've been working with an organization called Paz para la Mujer, and Paz para la Mujer has been in operation since the late 1980s. They began really working with domestic violence victims, then they expanded to women and children, then the LGBTQ community, and so after the hurricane, they're helping anybody that needs help, because that's what happened in Puerto Rico, and I'm sure in the Virgin Islands. All of a sudden, neighbors that you hadn't talked to in years or seen, right, all of a sudden, everybody's family, everybody's helping one another. And so Paz para la Mujer, I've been very involved with. I know a lot of people who work with them. It's a volunteer organization. And so I just started raising money for them because they needed it, and so if I may, I think when you go outside at the table, there's a little piece of paper that has the website, pazparalamujer.org. And if you're feeling generous today, please, anything that you could provide, from $1 to many thousands of dollars, they still need it, and they will need it for years in Puerto Rico and in the Virgin Islands.
Yeah, I would, your question, Frenchie, was, about the hurricanes we wrote about, but also about if we were able to write and who will write it. And the hurricane in my novel is called Hurricane Mary, but it's based on a hurricane that I lived through called Hurricane Marilyn that hit the Virgin Islands in 1995. It was my senior year of high school, and we didn't have electricity in my house for over 3 months. And we drew water from our cisterns, which were water containers that most Virgin Islanders have built underneath our homes. We went to school half day. because the schools had to do double shifts, and because there was no light, so you couldn't go all day, and people had a hard time getting there. It was a really tough time, but I used that experience in the novel, and since I'm primarily a fiction writer, it's fictionalized, and I named it Hurricane Mary because my novel Land of Love and Johnny, which I read from a little bit earlier, has a lot of religious references, and I wanted the Virgin Mary to be referenced in a particular kind of way, so I changed it from Marilyn to Mary, but it is indeed based off of Hurricane Marilyn. I would say that I hope it's not just me writing about these hurricanes in the next couple of years. Right now in the Virgin Islands, we are just beginning to have a national literature. What happens when you're a colonized space is that you read literature of the colonizer. So although I grew up reading Black literature, it was African American literature, and I didn't know that Paul Marshall or Carl Phillips or Edwidge Danticat or Jamaica Kincaid existed until I came to the States and took a Caribbean literature class. And realized that there was literature in my region being written about people who lived in the ways that I had lived. Before that, I actually thought that I was going to be the first Caribbean writer. Which, says something about my personality. But it also says something about the way that colonization keeps you ignorant, and keeps you from knowing about even your closest neighbors. So I didn't know that people were writing in Jamaica or Trinidad or even Puerto Rico for that matter, even though you can see Puerto Rico from the Virgin Islands. Which is to say that we are just now in the Virgin Islands doing this work, creating a literature that is a Virgin Islands literature. So when I think I think Bobby and Tony yesterday on the panel talked about being part of the second generation of Caribbean literature, and that those of us who read the poems dedicated to Walcott yesterday are maybe the third generation, and I was part of that panel of what we would call the younger poets, the younger writers, which I was like, yeah, younger. I feel like I'm not so young anymore, but anyway. So, we're the third generation, and we have different concerns than the first generationers had. In the Virgin Islands, I am definitely think of myself as part of the third generation of Caribbean writers, but I'm doing a lot of the work that the first generation did because I'm helping to create a sense of our cultural identity, which is to say, again, that I hope it's not just me writing about Irma and Maria in the next 5 years or to a decade. I hope we have lots of Virgin Islands writers writing and making art.
Does the topic draw you, though? I mean, okay, so we are 100 more days later. Most of Puerto Rico still doesn't have electricity. Is that a topic that the two of you are drawn to write about?
Well, you can't avoid it if you're writing about the tropics. It comes every year. So I think it's really hard to ignore the devastation of the winds and rains and that come every single year. But to go back to the previous question also, I hope that, I know that I probably will not be writing a novel or pretty much anything about Maria except my own, feelings about being in the United States and not being there during what happened. Feeling somehow guilty because I was comfortable. I mean, every time I was telling you, when I take a shower now, I'm doing it the way soldiers do it, to get wet, turn it off, because I was so aware that the people in my part of America were not able to do that. But I found great comfort in the writing of Puerto Rican writers on Facebook and through Twitter who were trying to express what was going on in the most emotional, beautiful, ugly, angry, every conceivable feeling was coming up every single day. And I found a young writer by the name of Edmaris Carazo and recommended her to my agent because I said, she's writing, I know you don't know Spanish. She's writing in Spanish. I hope she knows a little bit of English, and if she doesn't, I will translate her work because it's really good. And it turns out that she's bilingual. And so she was able to translate her essay into English, and it was published in a magazine called Catapult. It's an online magazine. And then, since then, she's been interviewed by the BBC, by CBS, by CNN. And so I feel like, well, I did something for the young writers who will be writing about this hurricane, and I hope that they will, and I hope that they will write it from every conceivable aspect of it, both because not only when you're going through a weather disaster, and all of you who live here know this, there's disaster, there's horror, but there's also a lot of beauty in the fact that nature can do this to us. We are completely helpless, and nature's in charge, and there's a certain beauty to it. And I think that we will see the poets and the short stories and the novelists and the essayists who will be compelled to tell this story from having been there and experienced it in a way that I couldn't even begin to understand.
I would say I wasn't there physically either for the hurricanes, and I agree with Esmeralda that they come every year. But for the Virgin Islands, and for Puerto Rico too, this was an unusual year. And what I think, unfortunately, it's not going to continue to be unusual. Because regardless of our politics, if we believe in science, we know that climate change is real. So it's isn't that sad that we even have to clap for that? Like, thank you for saying something radical. Why is that radical? So I think it's going to continue, and I think in particular for the Virgin Islands, because we were hit twice, that has not happened in our recent history. So when the hurricanes were Category 5 both when they hit the Virgin Islands, and that has never happened. And what that meant on practical levels is that people didn't have, many homes were without roofs, and then a hurricane hit, right? So you had homes that had tarps or nothing, and then another hurricane came. So that is momentous, I think, for Virgin Islanders, and so I don't think, as someone who has dedicated myself to chronicling the Virgin Islands, that I would be able to continue to be a Virgin Islands writer and not write about what has happened this past fall. So I think I will continue to, I think this will compel me to write, for sure. I would, because Esmeralda gave the plug for donating, I would want to just also say that if you feel compelled to support efforts in the Virgin Islands, that there's an organization called the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. That should be easy to remember. Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands, and they have a presence online, so you could just Google the Community Foundation of the Virgin Islands. And they support the U.S. Virgin Islands primarily, all our islands. And they've been a clearinghouse for a lot of the donations and would send things into appropriate places. You can even say, I would like this donation to go to this cause, to this aspect of the relief, and they will send it specifically to that aspect of the relief. So I work with them personally, so I can vouch for them personally. I would say, too, that in the Virgin Islands, we are the U.S. Virgin Islands and the British Virgin Islands, and that separation is a colonial separation. Most Virgin Islanders have family on both sides. And in the Virgin Islands at large, we have islands that exist below sea level, like Anegada, that are evacuated. Every time there's even a little drop of rain, the whole island is evacuated. And there is some legitimate fear that these islands just simply will not exist in a generation. And not like in 100 years, in a generation, which is like in 30 years. So for me, just writing about environmental destruction will, I think, have a larger place in my literature output, period.
There's just one point, I think, that we can't forget also about these devastating effects. I'm reminded of it because before my father passed away, we just happened to be talking about her. There was a storm coming to Puerto Rico, we were just talking about it, and I said, what hurricane do you remember? Because I remembered Santa Clara. I was old enough to have experienced it. But he had experienced San Ciprián and San Felipe, which had been the previous Category 4 hurricanes that have affected Puerto Rico. And that completely changed the island and really the history of the island, I would say. But the thing that was interesting to me here, I was talking to my 94-year-old father, who is still remembering himself being a 10-year-old boy huddled in these, they call them barracas that they would build whenever they thought a hurricane was coming. And so 80-something years, he was still suffering from the effects of having experienced that hurricane. So we have to remember that we're going to be hearing about this for the next 2 or 3 generations, right. People who went through this and who are still going through it, and who will need art to be able to understand it, and also to get through it, although you don't ever get over it.
I thought it was really special in your memoir when you talk about the gathering for the hurricane. You know, those of you who live here know you have what's basically a hurricane party. You know, you gather, anybody who does not live in a safe structure gathers in the home of someone who does. And I was really touched by the fact that what you remembered was the smells and the garlic and the sofrito and the food that was being cooked. And then the loss was kind of, it seemed almost tangential to
Right.
that.
Yeah,
So
well, when you're a child, you know, the thing is you want to feel safe. And so I felt safe in this place because I knew it was all our neighbors, my parents and my sisters and brothers. And so even though when we came out, it was a disaster, we felt safe in it. And so I felt safe. And so I don't know, you know, but I think my dad didn't feel that, you know, when he went through it. And I think my mom didn't when she experienced a hurricane in her lifetime that was stronger than Santa Clara. But for me, it was like, oh, party.
I was really struck by a few passages from your book, Tiphanie. One thing that when you're interviewing people about the hurricane, you ask people, what was it like? And you almost get the same quote over and over again. Oh my God, the noise. You had to hear the winds. And you described the winds like a woman who was howling out her broken heart. I love that line. And I copied 2 paragraphs. I was going to read them, and I didn't know if that's bad form. Do you want to read them? Or should I? All right, I'm going to read them. These 2 paragraphs are not, they don't follow each other in the book, but they both make the same point that I want to make. Some others were named. The latter had an identity, a persona. For years, the named storms were only women, which seemed fitting. They could be in love, they could be envious. Whether this hurricane was the Virgin or the Magdalene, no one knew until it was too late. Everyone said that Mary was an angry woman storm, either a jilted lover or a desperate mother. With a name like Mary, we should have known that she would be the worst ever. No one was prepared. How could we be? So now what struck me there is that she's very female. This is a very gender-based description of the storm, which I guess is easy if her name is Mary and you know, Hurricane Maria. So some of the big hurricanes have female names. I guess it's a 50-50 chance of whether it's going to have a male name. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about your decision you talk a little bit about the Virgin Mary. Do you see a storm as being female? Does she have a gender?
I'm not a essentialist. I mean, I am a feminist, I'll say that. I hope that's not radical. I mean, everybody should be. So I wouldn't want to be essentializing and saying, you know, that these things are male or female. But I found that it was interesting that at least before the 1960s, the US and whoever is in charge of naming on the national level the hurricanes was only naming them female names.
Right.
So they had, whoever those people were, that group of people, the national weather, blah, blah, blah people, had decided that things of nature were feminine, and that women were, you know, impetuous and wild.
And fierce.
and fierce. And that while we might take some power from that stereotype, there's also clearly like some negative assumptions about women being unable to contain ourselves or being logical or being that we are illogical and not logical and these things. So I found that, you know, offensive actually, and I wanted to question it. Like what is that? What was that about? And why do we still continue to think of nature as feminine in gender? And how does that maybe allow us to then fuck with it? Because we think of it as feminine, then maybe we can control it as we do women's bodies. Now I'm getting a little radical. And we can think of it as a thing that can be subsumed and taken, and sometimes we can be afraid of it because it can be wild, but for the most part, we know how to deal with it. So I found that interesting, and my book is about women mostly, particularly about two sisters, but it's narrated by the old wives of the Virgin Islands. And so I wanted to, in the book, I'm trying to problematize issues of gender. So by making Mary, in my case, a woman, a jilted lover, that the community thinks of her in this gendered kind of way. But then as the book goes on, the community continues to feel more, I hope, more complicated feelings about the genderedness of nature.
Esmeralda, in your novel, America's Dreams, you wrote something that really jumped out at me. You talk about a community that after Hurricane Hugo becomes a lot with mansions for the Yankees. And I thought it was interesting because you see a lot of speculation about that now. Everybody thinks that this was all a plot masterminded by, real estate speculators. What do you think? I mean, is it?
I don't think it's
Do
speculation.
you have property ready?
I don't think it's speculation. I think
Land speculation, I mean.
Land speculation. But I think Puerto Ricans are fatalistic, and the first thing that you start seeing once, after the hurricanes and people were able to communicate and tell us what was going on, so then becomes there was a lot of fear about, well, this was going to happen. They're going to take all the poor neighborhoods and they're just going to bulldoze them, and then they're going to put big, tall condos, and we won't be able to live in Puerto Rico. And you start seeing, and I'm sure you saw them when you were traveling there, signs that say, "No me quito," I will not be moved from here. No me voy. I'm not leaving. Even though, and I think the figure is up over 400,000 people who've had to leave. Many of them families because they had children who had to go to school because the schools are mostly closed still, except in some pockets. And I think it's a big fear that we feel, that our island is going to be taken away from us, and that's something that the diaspora feels and the people who are there feel, and we constantly try to figure out how can we prevent that, but we don't know how to do that, and so it becomes a whole asopao of politics and government and trying to figure out what do we do next, and I hope they don't bulldoze all the poor people's neighborhoods to put up condos, because that would be really sad.
You mentioned earlier about introducing the writer who was then on the BBC and all of this, and I know you've done a lot of interviews, and I wonder, when you get these calls to kind of like represent, you're like the dial of Puerto Rican,
Yeah.
It says Esmeralda Santiago. Do you like that because it gives you the opportunity to represent Puerto Rico in a positive way, or is it kind of annoying that they have to lean on someone who's not even there and who speaks perfect English to explain what's happening in Puerto Rico?
Well, at the very beginning, I was thrilled to be called because I said to myself, and probably to a lot of my close friends, even though the devastation of Maria and Irma also had touched Puerto Rico, I said, there's going to be another story in another week. And I said, I am going to make sure that they don't forget about Puerto Rico until things are like in a way that's normal for us, which is really crazy anyway. But I really felt like I will talk to anyone who wants to talk to me about Puerto Rico and what happened there. Then after a while, you do feel like, call J-Lo, Ricky Martin, they're much more famous, more people hear them, and can you call somebody who has, 3 million followers? I don't have that many, but all I can do, but So it's a combination. You don't want to say no because I really want to keep it in the news. I want people to constantly be reminded that this is not over and that it will not be over for a long time. But on the other hand, I'm just one little Puerto Rican lady living in Westchester who can't do very much except write about what it is to be a Puerto Rican. And so a lot of the time I just have to say, I can't talk to you, I'm writing, because now I've been able to do that.
Tiffany, what stories do you think still aren't being told?
Well, in the Virgin Islands, we don't have a J-Lo or Ricky Martin.
Or in Esmeralda, Santiago?
Or an Esmeralda Santiago.
Well, we have a Tiphanie.
But they have you.
Yeah, but I'm not,
no,
I'm not
teasing.
yet there.
I'm teasing.
As was said, I'm one of the young writers. So when I was, I did some work with Democracy Now! I was on NPR and CBS. I don't think the Virgin Islands got really even a quarter of the attention that we needed and still need. But I felt like Esmeralda, I was like, thank you that you even give a damn. I'm glad that I was available to pick up the phone. I'm glad I checked my email this morning, which I actually never do. So I felt like, okay, I'm glad the Virgin Islands is getting out there. It's complicated though, because as you can see from my personality, I do have, I am a political person. I think of myself as someone who is actively political, and I don't shy away from politicizing whatever I think needs politicizing. I curse a lot. I am a professor, but I'm a professor at a hippy-dippy institution, Wesleyan University. So, I realized that when I was doing this work of being called by NPR, that I wasn't representing Tiphanie Yanique, even though that's, as a fiction writer, that's who I am representing. I am normally representing my own version of things, and I understand the rhetoric is one that I am creating, and I'm an artist. But that when I was doing things on Democracy Now!, I was not Tiphanie Yanique, the writer. I had to be doing something. I couldn't curse, I couldn't talk about how angry I was about being a colony in certain kind. I was trying to get people to send money to the Virgin Islands. And I frankly did not want to piss people off because I wanted them to send people, send barrels, send FEMA, and what was eventually sent was the U.S. Army, which was ridiculous because, as some of you might know, the U.S. Army is not allowed to operate on U.S. soil. So what were they doing in the U.S. Virgin Islands? And yet, it was better than nothing because before that, we had nothing. So I felt like I was doing this work where I couldn't represent myself. I couldn't speak on behalf of my political views. I had to just get the government to be like, oh yeah, St. Thomas, I went there for my wedding anniversary.
Right.
Let's send them some prepackaged food because I knew that that's what we needed, and so I would say for me there was that anxiety. Right. But we still are struggling with homes that are not rebuilt, with electricity. Because we're a tourist destination, all the hotels went on electricity first. So tourism is up and running in the Virgin Islands, but it's a peculiar tourism where the tourists are taking pictures of homes that are still covered in tarps. And people are cooking. My cousins, my family members, aunts and uncles are cooking in the kitchen of the tourists at the hotels and are going back home and can't cook in their own house because this stove isn't working. So it's a complicated place right now. And so we need to continue to we need everything in the Virgin Islands. We need everything.
What do you think, Esmeralda? What stories still aren't being told?
Well, I was going to ask you.
No, I know you're going to tell me that I wrote every story.
Because you were there. But I really hope that the artists will not be discouraged because they have so many challenges to get through just to be able to do what they are meant to do, which is to create and to continue creating a culture in Puerto Rico. And so this is really, this is my biggest worry. This is what I cry about is, when I just recently heard about a young poet who was murdered post-hurricane. He survived the hurricane. He survived 3 months of no electricity, and then got murdered. And I'm going like, you are so stupid to murder a poet. I mean, you are going straight to hell because this is what we need right now. We need our artists, because if we don't have our artists, we're not going to have a society. It just doesn't exist without them. And so that is my biggest concern and my biggest worry right now, is to try and encourage people who are artistic or who are artists, and make sure that they don't get so discouraged by it that they lose their focus of what they need to do, because they are the representatives of humanity for many generations to come. And if they give up, we're not going to have it.
We have about 8 minutes left, so I was going to open it up to questions. Ask the two of you first. Is there anything that I've forgotten to ask you before I open it up to the audience? No? Okay, we're good.
You're doing a great job, Frenchie.
Oh. That's what you meant to say, right? Thank you. Any questions from the audience? There's, I think, some microphones.
Hi, I feel really grateful to happen to be in Key West right now to be listening to this. So I'm also a professor, and a few years ago I had a student who was Puerto Rican by background but grew up in Detroit, who has since moved to Puerto Rico. Anyway, we have stayed very close to each other. I'm very aware of what's going on. But I have two questions, really. So he happened to be in Detroit during the hurricane, but a few weeks later managed to get to Puerto Rico, where most of his family lives, and came back with many, many, many photos that I've seen and that he shared with me. And I was struck by how few photos like his I had seen in the media. There seems to be such an absence of the more tangible, not just words on a page, but the photos, the homes falling into the ocean and the mountain roads, that are impassable and all that. So I did want to ask sort of, where is all of that from any of you? And why do you think there's so little of it? But also you mentioned tourism. And so I'm curious about whether you think tourism right now in the Virgin Islands or in Puerto Rico gets in the way or is helpful to the people who live there. So thank you.
25% of the hotels in Puerto Rico are still closed, and half the island still doesn't have electricity. So I could see and most of the hotels that are open are filled with FEMA and those kinds of people. So, God bless the tourist who wants to come right now. Good luck finding a room, really. And I do think it's going to be critical to the island's recovery.
Yeah, I mean, tourism is an awful industry. It's a industry where the native, whoever she might be, has to perform her nativity for the tourist gaze. It's a really problematic industry. Nicole, whose book is about tourism to some extent, is clapping over there. And often in the Virgin Islands and in Puerto Rico too, you're eating, and Jamaica Kincaid has written a book called A Small Place that talks about this. You're eating a papaya that came from Florida, and you're sitting in the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, because that's how, transfer of goods is such a now messed up thing as well. So tourism has contributed to the fact that we don't have farms in the Virgin Islands anymore, and that we don't have. When I was growing up, the milk we drank came from our local dairy, and now it comes from Florida. So, tourism contributes to the removal of the very thing that the tourist comes for. The tourist comes for some sort of authenticity, and yet the very presence of tourism destroys authenticity. That being said, unlike Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands has one economy, and it is tourism. And we rely, everything surrounds tourism. Before we became American in 1917, and before that we had a very complicated economy. A lot of our economy then was around the production of rum and various kinds of rum products, bay rum, sugarcane, sugar, rum itself. And because right around when we were bought by the United States imposed prohibition across all of the US, all of our rum production and rum products were silenced. And so we had no industry all of a sudden. So we thought by becoming American, we were going to become a more economically viable space, and the opposite happened, so we relied on tourism. So I would say that for us, it's very complicated. We need visitors to come, because that's what we have. And it's all, the truth of it, I'm a Virgin Islander. I'm a native Virgin Islander, which is a complicated thing in the Virgin Islands too, who's a native, who's a local, who's a long-term tourist, whatever. I would say that the Virgin Islands is beautiful. It is really, really beautiful. It is as beautiful as the pictures make it look more beautiful. And that's complicated because that means that
it's still beautiful?
It is. Okay. I mean, it is. I mean, I would say that even in the aerial pictures, I mean, the pictures that came back from the Virgin Islands were devastating after the hurricanes. I mean, my partner and I went to high school together, and we saw the photos of the street that we both walked up to go to high school, not a street, but a river, a raging river, which is the street that our high school was on.
But you did see the pictures, so I think I'm going to push back a little bit about the guy from Detroit and his photographs, because I do think the media paid attention, at least to Puerto Rico. And if you didn't see enough photos, I think you should subscribe to the New York Times. I'm sorry, I had to do it.
Well, but I think that there is one aspect of it, though, that we're not seeing a lot of things, because the government of our islands don't want to show how much the devastation is, because then you will not go there. Right. And I think that they're really in an awkward position also, that we don't hear very much about the crime. We hear about the spike of how many people died. We haven't heard a lot about the crime on those islands. I don't know if in St. Thomas or the other Virgin Islands, if there has been a spike in crime, but in Puerto Rico, definitely, we're not hearing about that, because it makes it even worse than what it is. And they're trying to get as quickly as possible, get it ready for people to come and have a good time and enjoy themselves. And you don't want to be thinking about things like that. But that is the reality. I'm not keeping you from going to Puerto Rico, but you have to realize that after a disaster like that, these kinds of things happen. And it's in the interest of the tourist industry to not show us that side of it. And so we just have to, in spite of that, am I willing to go? I am. I'm willing to go, but you have to remember that there's a lot of stuff that you're not hearing about, right. And you will not hear about until somebody writes the book.
I want to push back to maybe in the other direction, which is that, I want you to come to the Virgin Islands. And I'm clearly I have some anger about tourism as an industry, but I want you to come because it's my home and I think it's beautiful, and the Virgin Islanders are welcoming people. I'm like, come, I'm gonna tell you where to buy the best, not jewelry, but like the best loaf of bread. I would love for everybody to come and visit. But that's how we think of our islands. We're small island people in the Virgin Islands, and so we are very welcoming. I think the problem for us is the way that the tourist industry creates alienation between the visitor and the native. Where in the Virgin Islands, you come to visit the Virgin Islands, and the truth is you are unlikely to actually be interacting with a Virgin Islander. And you're more likely to be interacting with other Americans who work at the hotel that you're visiting. So for us, that sucks for Virgin Islanders, because we want to be the one to tell you, welcome to the Virgin Islands. And often it's the son of your friend who lives on the street from you in Boston who's the one who's welcoming you to the Virgin Islands. So I would say it's complicated. But the first reports that came out of the Virgin Islands were about how crime-ridden it is after the hurricanes. And the reports I was getting was like, no, we're not having looting in the Virgin Islands, but all these Americans, these U.S. citizens, the U.S. citizens that were being evacuated from from St. Thomas, St. John, and St. Croix were coming back with reports of things like, we heard that there was looting downtown, and they were staying in the hotel in the countryside. And then that was actually being reproduced in the national news, looting in the Virgin Islands. When the people who were saying this are people who actually hadn't even been downtown where the looting was supposedly happening. So when I spoke to people who were home, they were like, what looting? Please, when you go on, tell them we're not looting, that's not happening. That actually the restaurants are open and are selling food or giving it away. People aren't breaking down the stores. That's not happening in the Virgin Islands. So for me, we were having the opposite thing. We were being marketed now as a place where all this violence was happening when actually it wasn't happening. And we wanted to set the record straight. I think in the Virgin Islands, the idea of looting is tied to like blackness and ideas of like the savages like ripping down their island. And it was very important to us that we show that we are not savages who are destroying our own island, that actually we're helping each other and rebuilding. And it was very offensive that that's what the national media had said about us.
Well, I did want to make one last point, that there was another forgotten hurricane, and it was in the Florida Keys, because this place, not Key West, but up the Keys, a lot of homes were destroyed, and a lot of people are really still suffering. And those of us who cover the Florida Keys were in Puerto Rico. So my apologies to the Florida Keys as well. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to get a nice round of applause for our panelists. Thank you.